please. My name is Sarah Lynn Bowman, as David mentioned, and I'm here with Alexandra Schreiber and Shelhedgard Hugos. And we're going to this is our third year being here, I believe, or at least second year, talking about the ROCKET project. And in the past, we have come and run role play scenarios for you. Unfortunately, we're not going to do that today because we have quite a bit of data we would like to go over with you about some of our interventions. Next slide, please. So we'll talk a little bit today about the ROCKET project. It's an Erasmus Plus cooperation partnership, which means that we have 3 different universities represented: Groningen University, Göttingen, as mentioned, and also Uppsala. We will talk about the critical virtual exchanges that we've been developing, the trainings specifically for the admin staff and the teacher trainings in depth. We'll talk a little bit about our research method and results and some of the benefits and drawbacks that we've noticed preliminarily from running these sessions. And then we'll have some time for questions. So Erasmus Plus ROCKET, as I mentioned, it's funded by the Erasmus Plus Cooperation Partnership. The goal of these Erasmus projects is to get organizations working together across international borders in EU. And it started mainly as a mobility fund, but it's sort of expanded so that we have this international collaboration that hopefully will last far longer than the project itself. So Alexandra and I are technically not needing to run any more student sessions, but we've decided to keep that as part of our institutional way of teaching for as long as possible, for example. We've been developing this working concept of critical virtual exchange that addresses conflict and its underlying sources, especially within issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the way we do that is through running educational role-playing games, short little scenarios for students, teachers, and administrative staff. And we will be converting all of our materials into an OER, Open Educational Resource, and that will be done by the end of June 2026. And so we very much welcome you to use some or all of this content in other contexts worldwide. Next slide, please. So a little bit, obviously, you probably, a lot of you know what conflict transformation is here, but we conceptualize it as developing a positive orientation to conflict as providing life-giving opportunities for growth. So many of us, including folks who have been at this seminar before, have talked about being conflict averse, actually. And I think that's natural for those of us who know what the consequences of conflict can be. So this is sort of shifting that orientation to be more positive towards it and to see if we can engage in some sort of constructive change with one another. We also think about positive peace, so focusing on meeting all people's needs as a condition of peace rather than just, the needs of some, or making sure that there isn't physical violence. And we're building our designs on transformative role-playing game design. This is a framework for another Erasmus project that we put together called EDGE. It's also a framework that we teach in our master's program in transformative game design, which we run through Uppsala University. And if anybody is interested in this kind of work, that is an online program, so you can take it from anywhere in the world, and it is asynchronous. You can see our textbook here. And then combined with those concepts, we're connecting to this critical virtual exchange and DEI. So thinking about ways that we can do online learning with one another over time across borders and focusing on intercultural communication. And these courses generally run between 6 to 10 weeks. So it's not just one little session, prolonged contact, asynchronously and synchronously. So discussion forums and journals, but then also through video conferencing. Yes. And also Alexandra's specialty, role-playing and intercultural learning, is a component here. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we have synchronous and asynchronous activities. We also have journals that are private where they're not engaging with each other, but we can read them. We're interested in exploring how intersectional factors contribute to conflict situations in higher education. And we aim to provide a theoretical understanding that is combined with embodied skill development through role play, which is actually quite similar, I think, to David's approach in a lot of ways. And we have concrete practices that help us understand and transform conflict and respond effectively in conflict situations. And we'll talk about those in a moment. And the goal is to improve interpersonal relationships with an emphasis, again, on intercultural learning. So this is not trying to solve issues of world conflict or try to establish world peace. We're focusing mainly on interpersonal relationships within a higher education framework. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have created this critical virtual exchange for students, which I mentioned. We've completed 2 of those so far. We've also done 2 workshops that are sort of shorter versions for students. The critical virtual exchanges are part of the Enlight Consortium. So our 3 universities are part of a 10 university funded project, essentially, to try to create as many linkages between these EU universities as possible. So the idea is that it can be a lot of an institutional challenge to transfer, for example. And so there's been a lot of effort to sort of have this sort of pan-European model for the way credits work, for example, and shared and critical virtual exchange is sort of along these lines. Yes, and so then we have these role-playing game scenarios that help provide experiences of conflict and have them practice skills in real time. So the idea is for them to have an escalated experience of conflict very shortly, and then to try to apply the skills in the moment. Next slide, please. But today we wanted to talk mainly about our admin staff training module and our teacher training. So the original program was developed with Shireen Khosropour, who many of you know, and we used it mainly to work with admin staff. And this group is really great. They're very engaged with these issues, and they're really interested in helping conditions within the university. They're very motivated. So this was a relatively light training compared to what I'm about to show you, but it focused mainly on conflict transformation through role-playing, and then also looking at issues of diversity, being able to identify oneself within this diversity wheel, for example, the different kinds of privileges and marginalizations that we have. And then also we've been developing these what are called whole institution maps. So ways to map across an institution the different resources that are available to students that they might not know about. We use Uppsala's Studium, and we're going to be a little practical here. For those of you who want to do this kind of work, you have to figure out whose learning management system you're going to use, who's going to grade those forums, who's going to set up the Zoom or whatever video conferencing you use, and then who's going to issue the digital badge. So in this case, we have the University of Göttingen doing most of the badges. And we also have the opportunity for a teacher training through the university, which is more like a certificate. So yes, there are a lot of practicalities involved that can make it a bit challenging. Next slide, please. So for the teacher training, on the other hand, we have to teach all 4 topics because we're trying to prepare teachers to actually be able to run these. So they need to also understand what a critical virtual exchange is, how it differs from other forms of online education. And they also need to learn about role-playing game theory and practice, so facilitation, safety, those kinds of things. So we have a 4-week mandatory core part that just gives them, a little dip of their toe into the content. And then we have some optional extension modules, so they can take all of those categories or some of them if they want to. And those are meant to deepen understanding and practices, including design. So they do get to do a little bit of game design and run it for their fellow participants if they choose to do so. And when I say games, I mean very short scenarios, so they're not super complicated. Next slide, please. So as you can see, it's a bit more complicated. We have the core modules in that first column, and then we have the extensions in the second column. And we get into more content related to conflict transformation. That was really important to us because we really couldn't cover much beyond positions, interests, feelings, and needs, and conflict styles in the first sessions. So we wanted to talk about things like power, culture, violence, and other important topics as well. So all of this will be available in the OER. Next slide, please. So as I said, they get to design their own scenarios, and those usually contain 3 people. So as person A has a problem with person B, and person C is either an observer or ideally in a neutral position of some sort. So they're meant to kind of be part of the scene, but not be the main driver of the scene. And some of the topics that we've created scenarios around include plagiarism in academic writing, working together on a class project and one person feels they've been doing the majority of the work, asking for a meeting with the professor to ask about, extra support, and also feeling left out due to language barriers. And we've actually been sourcing from our students, even today, some new examples. We have an advisory committee, and also, we have an advisory committee that includes students and admin staff and teachers. And we're trying to figure out scenarios that are relevant enough to anybody within a university context. Yes. So I won't get into too much about the scenario structure because that would take some time, but basically they're given a very, very basic structure, and then they get to kind of invent things as they go for the scene, which makes it more personal. And we don't give them specifically too many DEI aspects. We don't, for example, give them their gender or their age or their race or ethnicity, but they can bring those things in if they want to through what we call the hot seat mechanic. We do, however, have things like power dynamics, rank, and also culture embedded in some of the scenarios. And then we have immediate debrief questions, right, as they're at the height of the emotional intensity, thinking about what the character's thinking or feeling during the scene, and also sometimes trying tools such as the I statement to communicate with the other person about their needs. Next slide, please. All right, and now I move to Shell. I'm not sure, and I can't hear you on the, yeah, there we go.
Is it the right slide? Because this is not to do with the research results.
But you can do it anyway.
I can do it anyway. It's a little bit repeating what Sarah was talking about, that this is based on the Conflict Transformation Academy workshops that was developed by a team led by Shirin Khosropour, which some of you know. And the topics for the role-playing that we took data on include conflict transformation, conflict styles, aspects of privilege, and marginalization related to diversity. For instance, the isms, I statements, culture, worldview, cognitive dissonance, and positions, interest, feelings, and needs. So what we're trying to do really is to teach the theory behind conflict and try to pull out the pieces and have the students both experience conflict through the role play, but then also through debriefs and the framing get to try to apply a theoretical framework to the experiences they had, and then better understanding what makes up conflict. Next slide, please. Yes, we had participants fill out surveys after they did their courses. For the teacher training, this was from September to November, and for the admin staff training, this was from October to November. So this is very hot off the press, and the survey is still open for stragglers who might fill it out later. We have been trying to get as many as possible in the last week to fill it out. For the teacher training, we had about 25 participants from a range of universities and institutions within the Enlight network that Sarah mentioned, this European Universities Consortium and beyond, Göttingen, Groningen, and Uppsala, which we represent, but also from Galway, Bratislava, Vilnius, country, Beja, Tunisia, and Rochester in the US. With Tunisia and the US here, we cover 3 continents, although we're not that international. We're mostly EU. For the admin staff training, we had 18 participants from universities of, once again, R3, but also from Tartu in Estonia, Basque Country in Spain, and from Bratislava University. Next slide, please. So that would make 43 respondents. But so far, we only actually have 14 people who have taken the survey. We know that is a very low number to make any sort of statistical analysis on, but we will be presenting the data because it is very much aligned with data we have previously collected from when we ran this with students. So we are quite sure that this data, even if we had all respondents, the data would not change significantly. So the survey we have run them through has, when it comes to the quantitative part of it, it has 24 survey questions. 23 of them ask participants to rate their experience. And then there's one question, an estimation of number of hours spent on preparing for and participating in the course. Do that in pre-defined interval groups. There's also qualitative questions we asked, and we will cover that one later. But for now, first the quantitative. Next slide. A little bit of demographic. Since there's so few respondents, we have only included a couple of demographic questions because we do ask some fairly personal questions in the demographic, and with so few respondents, we don't want to run the risk of somebody being able to identify any of our participants. But we can look at the age range, and this might also be relevant later when we look at the results, is that for the teacher training, everybody was in the same age group. Very uniform result, whereas for the administrative staff, it was a much more spread out age groups. Basically almost everything except we had nobody under the age of 30. Next slide, please. Also, which was a little bit interesting, was that we had, when we asked about neurodiversity, none of the participants shared that they were neurodivergent. This is an interesting result for us because we have always gotten in all other surveys results showing that people are neurodiverse or self-reporting neurodiversity in some form or another. We don't really know what that is down to. Maybe it is a completely neurotypical group, but it was an interesting result for us. In regards to gender, the majority identified as women, with a couple identifying as men and one participant preferring not to say. And you can see how they split between the two groups here. Now, this is interesting because, of course, our experience working with conflict transformation is that it is heavily gendered towards women taking our courses and men choosing not to. And that is, I think, an issue that we are trying to work with and trying to do something about, because we recognize that when it comes to the understanding of conflict as something that can be transformed into something positive, but as to the degree that there is a gender differentiate here, we believe that men probably need this training more. Next slide, please. Also, I can say that as the man among the presenters. We asked some questions around motivation along a 7-point Likert scale. The teacher training participants scored, jumping back and forth, scored the role-playing elements very high. The administrative staff training scored lower, but still relatively high. You can see the numbers here. So what we do in this approach is we have some questions that are framed in the positive, some questions that are framed in the negative. That is a way for us to weed out if somebody is just clicking every single 1 or every single 7 just to get through it. And what we find is that they correlate, because the positive expressions are scored high and the negative ones are scored low. So they do enjoy playing role-playing games, even though it's a very new experience for the vast majority of our participants. Next slide, please. We also have a similar survey part where we do the same 7-point Likert scale, and we ask questions about conflict transformation and to what degree they will find this useful skill for them in their private life and in the future. They, in this case, the sets of participants found conflict transformation very useful, with teacher training participants finding it extremely useful. We have high 6s, like that is very, very high on a 7-point Likert scale, showing that for the people, there is, of course, a level of self-selection here, because you have to be somewhat interested in conflict transformation to sign up to our courses, but also the theoretical concepts we've been teaching in the course clearly rank as useful to our participants, and they find that they can then apply them in their daily lives outside of the course, which we think is quite wonderful feedback. Next slide, please. Then one of the things we work a lot with is making it so that participants feel safe enough to be vulnerable, and that is sort of a prerequisite for role-playing games to really have that effect that we want them to have. And so we measure this through a similar survey with a Likert scale where we ask questions related to relatedness to other participants. And what we found in this particular survey, high degree of trust in both groups. There's some difference in belief in future friendships, where the teachers tend to be more positive thinking that they could form future friendships with other participants. The administrative staff a little bit less. We kind of believe, especially for the administrative staff, we think that it's more a case of people being scattered all across and everywhere, and feeling that distance would make it difficult. What we find, which I think is super interesting, is that for teachers in academic institutions, being connected internationally to other teachers is much more common than for administrative staff to have the same experience, which probably also skews these results. Next slide, please. Overall satisfaction, the one that really matters at the end of the day. Did they actually enjoy this experience? The administrative staff showed fairly high degrees of satisfaction, while teacher training showed extremely high degrees of satisfaction. And especially for this teacher training, once again, 6s and high 5s. That is not just two hands meeting in the air, but it's also the score here, 5.6, is a really, really good satisfaction score. But also the administrative staff score high. A mean on a 1 to 7 Likert scale is 4. Everything above 4 is above average. Everything above 4.5 is good, and so on. people were satisfied as well. They did not feel that they wasted their time. Lastly, time spent on course activities for the administrative staff. Numbers of hours spent on preparing and participating was fairly consistent across all respondents, about 8 to 12 plus hours. That is fairly close in time investment. Teacher training, they differ a little bit more, but that is most likely a result of optional extensions. Sarah showed you in the structure, you could go deeper into several of these extensions, and that would of course very much affect the number of hours. What we see here though is that when you look at the amount of weeks these courses were supposed to run, it seems like teacher training, we kind of overloaded that a little bit more with content than we did the administrative staff, and we will talk more about that in our findings. Next slide, please. And with this, I hand it over to Alexandra for the qualitative results.
Thank you, Shell. So we had 3 text survey questions that were coded using thematic analysis and were generated as word cloud from a generator that was used in Qualtrics, and emerging themes included role play discussions, interaction times, and schedules. I have to go back to my second screen here to jump to the next slide. So some word clouds on enjoyment. So responses focused on role play sessions, discussions, and interactions with the student group, and highlights were the synchronous live sessions and connections and interactions with other participants. And some comments highlighted also the skill of the facilitators, which is important to mention because often the participants were first-time role players. So they really left their comfort zone when joining the course, and when they kind of highlight the skill of the facilitators, this also means that hopefully they were in what Shell and Sarah are working on, a transformative container. So that is interesting improvement. Some improvements for the teacher trainings included recommendations to have more interaction within the group of participants. That connects also to the quantitative results that Shell just presented, that they were of the high satisfaction. Other answers were related to time, including the time differences across geographical regions. That is when people log in from different parts of the world, scattered times for synchronous sessions, and time schedules for synchronous sessions. Of course, it's always difficult to meet the requirements of such a highly diverse group of participants. Some teacher training participants commented on the workload being either a little too heavy or not spaced out enough. That again relates, you saw that on the slide with the overview of the teacher training with the core and extension modules. One participant from the administrative staff training asked for more practical and less theoretical work. So that is interesting. We always, not always, but in the previous research experiments, we also have, some outliers and some people who have different needs. Let's take a look at the workload for improvement for teacher training. Participants wanted more time for discussion and more role-playing sessions. As offering role-play as an innovative teaching and learning format, this is something that meets the goals that we're trying to aim at for the ROCKET Erasmus Plus training. Let's take a look at some benefits and drawbacks. Benefits are definitely to be able to offer innovative teaching and learning approaches, bringing also conflict transformation, role play, and the understanding of issues related to diversity, equity, inclusion to this main target groups in higher education. The target groups are students, teachers, and administrative staff. Another benefit is that through the ROCKET Erasmus Plus project and the trainings offered, we are aiming at improving European higher education while also connecting to local communities. That is one aspect that ROCKET has incorporated in the program to able to reach out and to spread, although the target group is for higher education. Another benefit is that the training and workshop materials will be made available as open educational resources under a Creative Commons license to be reused, hopefully also by you, adapted and shared by those interested in applying them for their own respective contexts. So even if we are working in higher education, everyone is then invited to use that for their own contexts. And then Another benefit is that working interdisciplinary as participants and consortium members offers new insights, a change of perspective, and learning opportunities to build competency in each other's fields, adding for personal and academic growth. And I can speak for myself. I have been on a steep learning curve, and it has made my life as a teacher and as a person much more richer and in-depth. Let's take a look at some drawbacks. So designing and conceiving material that is brand new across disciplines, across universities, and most of the time also in online settings requires more time to communicate and to collaborate. And it in general requires time. And it requires more time because you may know that working in an online context has different rules than when you're working in person. The use of 3 different learning management systems across university also requires time and energy to adapt to and may lead to misunderstandings. Just because there is this proverb saying the eye sees what it seeks. So when I'm working on my learning management system, I just know where things are. I have to relearn, which is a great learning opportunity, but it may lead to misunderstandings. Incorporating different schedules, structural and logistical requirements into deliverables for the commonly shared project can be challenging. And then there are issues on copyright requirements that can lead to the need of designing new material in order to be released as OER. And we have seen that from Shell's and Sarah's Evocative Games company that has been designed new material in order to be released as OER. Shell already mentioned a small sample size. We had 5 participants in the survey for the teacher training and 9 for the administrative staff training. These are some drawbacks. Well, and now we're curious to hear some of your questions. And thank you very much for listening.
Wonderful. That was great. I have a question. So my question has to do more broadly with experiential education, right? If I can, I'm going to kind of broaden it a little bit because I know holistically the work that you do. And then I know there's some questions specifically about this program. And I'm curious about, and you telling us a little bit about LARP. Because it's something that I know you're all involved in to some extent. And it is something that I was first introduced to when I went to visit you all last summer. So I know that it's not particularly germane to the presentation you're making, but it is something that I think people would have more curiosity about. So if you could talk a little bit about that, maybe that would be really helpful, I think, to this audience. And then I know there are some specific questions in the chat with regard to this presentation. So if someone wants to take that.
Shell, go ahead.
Go ahead, Shell.
I was going to say that sounds like a Sarah question, to be honest. But I can start us off. Yes, live action role playing. We find, and it's an emerging field of research and of practice where live action role playing games are being used for much more than just leisure activities. And I mean, you say, for instance, that you were introduced to it when you came here this summer, which I think is not exactly correct, because what you're doing with the Forage Center with your training is at least a cousin activity, if maybe not exactly the same. So what we do is we leverage the power of play, basically. We can create the alibi for players to act in ways that they would not do it if they were themselves. And by doing that, we can explore different opportunities, different paths untaken, and really get to shed ourselves of all these preconceived notions and personal preferences of how things should be, and explore with more curiosity what other options there are. For instance, if you get to play a character that is supposed to be more of the leadership qualities, be more outspoken, maybe that can help you to do that as well also in your daily life when you experience that. I can actually take up some space. I can actually speak publicly, for instance, and then you can integrate that into your life. And it's particular in relation to conflict. When we are in conflict in our daily lives, we get very easily entrenched, right? And so it becomes very often a case of winning an argument. When we can do in role-playing games, well, first of all, we can give you a conflict that you're not personally very heavily invested in. We give you a character that's heavily invested in it. But then we also give you the ability to then bypass your own entrenchment and have an experience through play how it would be to, first of all, have a different opinion, but also then maybe be convinced that your opinion might actually not be as solid as you thought, and be open to changing your mind. In addition, also, we teach a lot about, instead of conflict being a competition where somebody can win, we try to teach how to be curious about why the other people have that position that they have, right? So you get more curious about their position rather than having to hammer them with, you are wrong and you're a terrible person for having this opinion, right? If that makes sense. But Sarah can jump in at any time because this is absolutely her field.
I will say in these scenarios, we ask them not to understand each other very well. We ask them to escalate because they have like 3 minutes to feel something, and we want to, we invite them to not be as good at resolving conflicts as maybe they are already good at. But yes, the metacognitive process of realizing I can have a different opinion. We're in another project called LARPocracy, which is where we're trying to learn how to use LARP as a tool for democratic skill building. And we've been very much working on the position level and how to get people to be less entrenched in sort of knee-jerk almost political identities through LARP. So there's many, many, many things you can do with it. This is probably the most basic thing you can do with it, but it's also tricky to facilitate because it means that you have a very short amount of time to create a very targeted experience for a very small group of people, which means that we have lots of facilitators needed in order to have, an average size class. So I would say that's also a drawback that we could put onto there. What makes it different from simulation and other forms of educational role-playing or experiential learning is in part what we learn from our leisure community in a way that then gets fed back into the educational experience. So we have all sorts of techniques for safety, for example, for narrative that we bring in, and those are quite different than what we would find in most simulations, I would say.
So got some questions from students. Sylvester, I'm asking you to unmute yourself.
I am sorry.
That's all right. You had a question, so
late.
you put it in the chat, so you might as well ask it in person.
I think I'm not quite sure if I misheard it or misunderstood it, but was the program basically for interpersonal conflict transformation? So
Yes.
if so, the question that I have is, are there opportunities for it to be transformed into a state level or macro level application, basically? Because my personal interest lies more in macro level restorative justice transformation on that environment.
Sylvester, also before the answer, why don't you introduce yourself? I want to make sure with my grad students they particularly introduce themselves.
You guys can see me.
No, you don't have your screen on. You can turn
Okay, that's better.
Okay.
So I'm Attorney Smets or Dr. Smets student at Carter. I am actually an older person. I'm a retired military veteran, a former police officer. I came back to school during the pandemic and made a mistake of telling people about it. So I can't stop. So I'm finishing up my conflict resolution and is hopefully going towards international law in order to concentrate on human trafficking. And so the program that you have is very interesting to me, but I want to know if that's applicable to my goal and people like me who are interested in merging a peace building with justice restoration, especially to victims of human trafficking.
Can maybe answer. I don't know why my name is Shell on the screen. Does it seem? Sorry about that. So the reason that we work on an interpersonal level is it's just much easier to do skill building that way, right? Like it's difficult to think of, it becomes more abstract when you start thinking about things on a global level. And sometimes it can even be a little bit more dehumanizing, ironically enough, because we're kind of creating things on like very much more theoretical basis rather than the lived somatic personal experience. So the goal is not to try to solve the really challenging problems of the world, but rather to give us the skills and the tools to understand how to handle conflict in the moment. And those skills could just as easily be used in a diplomatic negotiation, for example, as they could when negotiating who's going to do the dishes. I mean, there's still the same basic principles. So our idea is that, and this is very much comes from the work with Shireen, is that, learning the principles in ourselves can then help how we move in the world, and that can be scaled in a way. But the training itself, we really shy away from direct issues of power and injustice and exploitation, because it's very difficult to role play that without it becoming, first of all, very potentially problematic for students to be embodying or with each other, because stereotypes and improper behavior and stuff can happen when people start getting a little bit of character, and maybe people misunderstand them or feel harmed. So it gets really tricky when you start bringing in issues of discrimination, for example. Yeah, and then also because, I forgot what I was going to say as a result of that. But yeah, that's one of the main issues. But I think that the principles that we're teaching and the scenario design could easily be adapted, right? So we have this like very simple ABC structure. You could adapt that in a different context that is more, meaningful to the work you do. But it's still at its core about interpersonal relations, which, if we think about people in charge of countries, a lot of times that's interpersonal, even if it's people representing a whole group of people. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes.
Thanks, Sylvester. So thank you. Jim, I'm going to ask your question live.
All right. Well, great. Well, first off, thank you very much for spending time with us this morning. I found your presentation inspiring.
Introduce yourself too, Jim.
Of course, because I'm that person. I'm sorry. Jim Wilkie. I am, of course, Professor Smith's student and former military, retired now, seen the conflict side, now focused on peace building and stability operation, because that other side is just not a good thing. So my focus here, of course, is how we get through conflict. And your presentation really kind of gives me hope. My real question to you is, I understand this is focused in the universities. Any consideration for expanding it out to the U.S., such as maybe GMU's Carter School as a starting point, because God knows the U.S. could use a little bit of this right now with the extreme polarizations going on. So that's my question: is any chance of that happening?
Actually, our work originated from the US with Shireen Khosropour. So we definitely have people within the US that have capability to teach some of these things. Other of these things, it's more tricky because of the current political situation. So I won't go into a lot of detail about that, but we have to be careful what words we use, for example, to talk about the things that we do. So I definitely think there is room for that. We just need to be to consider the best way to approach the material, if that makes sense.
Can I also just add to that? And Sarah mentioned that everything we create becomes an open access resource. That's how EU funding works to the Erasmus project. That everything you create should be open access to anyone to use in whatever capacity they want to. So at the end of the project, towards summer 2026, everything will just be open for all of you to take a look at. But also, when I was at it, because Sarah reminded me something here, also to Sylvester's question, a lot of the theories that we use to address interpersonal conflict actually comes from the sphere of international conflicts, nation-state conflicts, and so on. So we have brought those down on the micro level, which of course means that they can absolutely very easily then be brought back to the macro where they originally came from.
Yeah, and I remembered the thing that I was going to say is that the principle here is that you can't really affect change in other people. You can only really start with yourself. So that's how we work. And that means that if the other party isn't willing to engage in a respectful way, then you might not have a good outcome. But at the very least, we can control our own behavior, if that makes sense.
Kiti, did you want to, I'm not sure if it's a question or if it's a statement, but did you want to verbalize it a little bit and introduce yourself?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
My name is Lakita Prenti, and I'm a doctoral student at Abilene Christian University, and my concentration is conflict resolution. I really think it's transformational leadership is so important. I think it will help supervisors move into being leaders instead of I'm just here to tell you what to do, and to help provide people guidance and help them to reach their goals. I think some people lose sight of that. Managing is not about I'm just giving you orders, but I'm here to help you and help to build you up. So that way I'm not just trying to make myself look good. It's to help us look good and to help our organization to be productive and to be able to just grow people. And I think people just lose the sight of that. So I really think that role playing and modeling will help leaders to have those crucial conversations with employees, and also help to grow the employees into becoming leaders themselves. So I really like the idea of transformational leadership and resolving conflict in a positive manner.
Yeah, I completely agree. And unfortunately, we don't always get a lot of people in leadership position in these courses. We get people that are kind of in the middle, right? It would be, I think Shireen has potentially run things for leaders before, but it's an area where it's desperately needed, as you say. And so I very much encourage you to use these materials in that context if you have the opportunity.
You've mentioned Shireen a couple times, and of course we all know who she is, but I don't know if everybody else in this room does.
I'm just mentioning as much as she wants me to mention.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay. So we are at 45 minutes. We'd like to take a break. We'd like to thank Sarah, Alexandra, and Shell for being here today across the pond, so to speak, and joining us.